offering a different view to others shows that obviously the process is subjective. So it's all a bit of a game. And so in my TEDx talk, I talked about the idea of unbiased news or objective news being a marketing illusion or a myth. And, not to mention that this all has a dramatic effect on the awareness of the populations about, obviously various different issues, including the one that Dr. Ray has mentioned. And it even, these contradictions and these it is hypocrisy for journalists or their news organizations to proclaim to be offering scientific analysis of the world, true insight into a situation, when they should have the intellectual and moral integrity to know that that is disingenuous and that that's not true and that it is absolutely subjective. Just today, it's obviously Sunday, I was having a bit of a day off, and I was just flicking between news channels on terrestrial television here in the UK, just for the purpose of, intellectual analysis, just seeing, how they're playing current geopolitics and their coverage at the moment. And it's, really, if a donkey could discern the biases, if they were given the information of the different foreign policies of different countries, particularly on something as clear as the Syria crisis, it's so obvious what the different biases in the organizations are. I could name them, but there's no point in naming one over another, because they all of the main commercial channels, they all have a bias. And as humans, we all have biases. So that's what I tried to communicate.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, there was a Democracy Now! Piece where they indicated the conflict of interest, rather, that many of the pundits on TV had with regards to a strike on Syria. In other words, they had some interest in the military-industrial complex. In terms, you gave me that YouTube channel, and that's something that you were touching on, Dr. Ray, in one of your sermons, about how there must be evidence to have a position, and how we're all sort of biased by our own little echo chamber or our own little upbringing to have certain preconceived notions about something.
It's very arrogant to claim that you're only interested in the truth, because truth is always subjective, but it doesn't have to be idiotic. The book of Genesis describes the creation of a flat earth, and if you still think that's up for debate, you've missed a number of really good introductory courses in science. And I have to say, Mr. Fuhrer, I really appreciated your TEDx talk in Copenhagen, and I can tell you, as someone that's only been in Copenhagen in the dead of winter, you picked a better time to go than I did. But your documentary topic on Palestine is just one of the topics that, at least on this side of the pond, we get almost nothing but misinformation that is so pro-Israel from all of our commercial channels that any really in-depth understanding of what the real tensions are in the Middle East are almost symbolic. Even to have a sitting president of the United States just say they hate us for our freedom, and have people actually kind of buy into that notion that we've done nothing to provoke the hostility that is felt towards us, that we didn't send our CIA in to lead a war in Iran to boot out a freely elected government and put in a Shah, or that we allowed our oil companies to literally grab and steal resources for generations from these people. And then we tell ourselves, well, even on Morning Joe recently, one of the very popular MSNBC news stations, Joe Scarborough, who was a United States congressman, announcing they hate us because they hate us, as if it were completely irrational. No connection to tens of thousands of deaths in their countries and horrible crushing poverty as a direct result of our interference in their sovereignty. But I don't know how much American TV you get to watch, but when it comes to the topic of climate change, which is something really frustrating to me, 94% of scientists are united, or at least in symbolic or consensus agreement, that human activity is changing the environment, heating up the planet. But whenever our media talks about it, they always have to have a climate denier have just as much time as if it were a 50-50 conversation. It's these false equivalencies that are killing the American conscience so that we cannot make informed decisions about any of our policies. The media is completely failing to educate us in the issues that really matter.
I want you to respond, Harry.
I totally agree with Dr. Ray. It's wonderful to see, hear someone say what I was thinking. I totally agree. And, that's such a perfect example, the one about climate change. This sort of false need to balance everything, and just the very notion of the need to balance climate change as something being man-made. In Europe we have the story of the missing child Madeleine McCann, which is a media frenzy oriented around the disappearance of this girl. The BBC, for example, doesn't feel the need to balance its coverage of this girl being presumably abducted. So why should something as clear, morally clear as, the future of our planet need to be balanced? Well, actually, one of the main reasons why it ends up being balanced is because in the US you have the best media that the lobbyists can buy, as well as the best Congress that can be bought, and etc. And it's a hypocrisy and it's a manipulation. And I don't know whether or not there is a really strong trend in the USA of people waking up to that. But in in Europe and in the UK, I would say that there is a small trend of people waking up to those biases, and people are sort of turning it off, really. But it still has that kind of insidious baseline impact, that kind of drone of the commercial news, and it really has a stupefying effect. And I think particularly in North America, I've been to Canada and USA, I think really the news has a particularly stupefying effect in comparison to Western Europe, actually.
Yeah. It's sadly true. And of course, those of us who have some resources will have cable and satellite television, and we'll have satellite radio. And I'm sometimes infuriated by how good the BBC is compared to our national public radio, when in size of, when you look at the proportion of Great Britain versus the United States, we ought to have a much better public radio news source than the BBC. But even though your country is so much smaller, they put a lot more resources into the BBC. And frankly, if you guys would quit talking about football all the time and give us a little bit more news, we could depend on you as a more reliable source.
Well, one of the things you asked, Dr. Ray, is you asked, can we be bigger than our fear? And that's something that the media is sort of playing to or appealing to, is our fear with regards to the Syria crisis, with regards to the Israel-Palestine issue. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I also teach on an adjunct basis for Drury University here in Springfield, Missouri, and we oftentimes have tremendous guest lecturers that come through, but we had a guy in from Homeland Securities a few years ago, and I just raised the question, aren't Americans placed at much greater risk by the flu than by terrorism? And I thought the man was going to come off the stage and start a fistfight with me. We are so dependent on running our government and our economy based on fear that one guy had plastic explosives in his shoes, and we've all had to take our shoes off for 10 years. Thankfully, the guy that had explosives in his underwear didn't make us all have to take off our underwear to get on a plane. But when you go to any shipping dock in the United States on either coast, all of these containers come into the United States, very few of which are ever searched, but they keep us in a constant anxiety to get on and off of an airplane and immigration, when if any terrorist with a double-digit IQ really wanted to wreak havoc in the United States, you wouldn't bring it on a plane, you ship it. But but our own Homeland Security has outgrown the size of the Pentagon in the number of employees and the size of their infrastructure, all predicated on fear. And I don't know what level. I think we've done away with the color level of threat, but how do you really differentiate when it goes from orange to red? What do you do differently?
I would kind of just add to that. The thing which really does horrify me about what's happened since 9/11 with the, now people don't use the term global war on terror, but basically it's now embedded in us. What does scare me is that now with the surveillance system that we've got and the national security states that we have in North America and in Western Europe, what scares me is that there's going to be a rise of the kind of lone wolf attacks which can't be stopped by the security services. And in a way, now the security state has become so invasive. The only thing, I put in inverted commas for rhetorical purposes, the only thing left for the terrorists to do is to go about operations on a lone wolf basis and become, quote unquote, martyrs and etc. And we've kind of, had such an attrition against what terrorists can do that presumably it'll get to the stage where we see more of these basically unstoppable lone wolf attacks. We had one obviously recently in London. And I don't see how that can be stopped, sadly, and that is terrifying, I think. I mean, not as terrifying, empirically speaking, as, being struck by lightning or, catching the flu or being in a car crash, alluding to what the doctor says. Empirically speaking, we shouldn't be afraid of these things. But in a national security context, look what we've done. We've basically driven back organized terrorists, and now presumably it's going to become in this almost anarchistic, lone wolf style.
Yeah, but I just think we need to stop legislating by fear. That realistically, and here in the United States, we have over 30,000 gun deaths a year, but we're not allowed to talk about that. In the UK, it's typically in the dozens. In Japan, it's sometimes fewer than 10. But we're not allowed to publicly discuss in any meaningful way, even after this Sandy Hook school shooting, when it appeared that the president and several big city mayors